Americans often ask, how can such a small ethnic group preserve its soul over thousands of years, from the ancient mountains to modern cities like New York and California? And I always respond with a sentence that leaves them speechless. Because the Tao people do not just carry luggage when they migrate, they carry an entire world, the world of Vuong. This story is unlike anything you have ever heard. It does not begin with a royal dynasty, nor with a historical ancestor, but with a legend so vast it stretches across the sky. The Tao people's creation myth. Every Tao child hears this legend from the moment they are born, and even when they grow up in the busy streets of America, they carry it in their hearts like a compass guiding them back to their roots. Long ago, when the world was still in chaos and the earth was nothing but rocks hidden in the mist, Vuong appeared like the first beam of light tearing through eternal darkness. The Tao believe that Vuong is not only their forefather, but also the great master of the mountains and forests, the one who set rivers flowing in the right direction and raised mountain ranges from the ground to shelter future generations. Before there were villages, before language existed, before the bright red traditions of Tao clothing were born, there was Vuong, whose hands shaped all of existence. He breathed life into stone and gave rise to every living creature. He gathered the fire of the heavens into a soul and placed it in each Tao child, instilling in them a pride and resilience that would never fade. And from that very first breath, the journey of the Tao people began. The legend tells us that Vuong had 12 sons. Each one was sent to a different corner of the world to explore and build the destiny of the people. They crossed wild forests, silver streams, and valleys so cold that every breath turned into smoke. And everywhere they went, trees began to grow, water ran clearer, and human life began to take root. The first Tao were not people running from something. They were pioneers. Pioneers who opened up paths, founded villages, and carved out a new understanding of what it means to endure. Every step they took was a bridge between myth and reality. But the origins of the Tao people are not just rooted in legend. That legend became their guiding star through centuries of migration. When they were forced to leave their homeland, crossing mountains and venturing into foreign lands to survive, whether in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, or later the United States, Vuong remained with them. He lived on in the stories told by the fire, in the rituals praying for peace, in the echo of drums during every New Year festival. The Tao believe that no matter how far they travel, whether they live in Manhattan, Minnesota, or in quiet neighborhoods in California, their ancestors walk with them, offering protection like the oldest mountain ranges once did. When the 12 sons of Vuong first set foot on Earth, the heavens and the earth seemed to tremble. The young forests bowed before them, and rivers shifted their courses to make way for their passage. The Tao people believe that, at that time, the world was still as soft as clay, and every step taken by Vuong's sons left sacred imprints on the land, shaping the destiny of their people for generations to come. There were no castles, no borders, only endless mountain ranges cloaked in a white mist, like a giant robe draped over the land by the sky itself. And in that untouched wilderness, the Tao people began to form their first sense of identity, living in harmony with nature, but never submitting to it. Legend has it that the eldest son of Vuong was the first to lay eyes on a vast valley where a stream of crystal-clear blue water flowed between towering cliffs. That stream later became the ancestral spring, where the very first ceremonies were held. The other sons also discovered different lands. They called out to one another, and together, they built the first village. They lit fires using dry branches and kept the flame burning through the night, just like how Tao families today light incense during the New Year and never let the flame go out. That fire was not only a source of warmth, it was a vow. No matter how far they would travel, they would always find their way back to one another. The Tao were born into hardship. In those early days, wild beasts outnumbered people. To survive, they learned to listen to the forest, the roar of tigers and leopards, the subtle crack of a dry branch warning of danger, the rushing sound of water revealing the presence of poisonous springs. They used leaves as medicine, vines as belts, and stones as weapons. One day, the fourth son of Vuong witnessed a bolt of lightning strike the earth, sparking a massive blaze. He ran straight into the firestorm, grabbed a flaming branch, and brought it back to the village. That moment is remembered as the day the Dao people tamed the fire from the sky, a turning point that allowed them to survive in the wild. Even today, Dao families in the United States, living in modern homes with gas stoves and electric ovens, still tell this story with pride, as if it had just happened yesterday. As time passed, Dao villages began to flourish. They built homes along the mountain slopes, their backs resting against the forest, their faces turned toward the valleys. These homes were simple and small, but filled with children's laughter and songs, welcoming each new season. The Dao believe that every sunrise is a rebirth. That is why they open their doors to the sun, to the wind, and to whatever new challenges await. Over generations, they became strong and resilient, like the cypress trees that grow on mountaintops. Roots buried deep in the earth, branches reaching straight into the sky, never breaking even in the fiercest storms. And then their great journey began. The journey to leave their ancestral lands and travel to faraway places. Not because they wanted to abandon their homeland, but because fate pushed them forward in search of new places to live. Their footsteps would eventually take them to Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and finally to the United States. But before they could cross great mountains, they had to overcome their very first trial, a mysterious plague that plunged their entire village into chaos. The plague came without warning, like a shadow falling over the still young village. At first, it was just a few people collapsing after a cold wind swept through the mountain pass. But then, one night, the fire in the home of Ban Vuong's seventh son suddenly went out. When everyone rushed over, all they found were the faint breaths of those lying helpless on the ground. No one knew what was happening. Deep in the forest, the birds stopped singing, and the streams no longer echoed with their usual murmurs. The sun still rose each morning, but its light seemed dimmer, as if human fear had dulled its shine. It was the first time the Dao felt the fragility of life, and the first time they faced a choice between life and death, leave or be swallowed by darkness. The eldest son immediately gathered everyone around the largest fire in the village. Smoke rose high, as if sending a plea to the heavens. The Mo masters of that time, the ancestors of today's shamans, listened to the forest, read signs from the sky, but all omens were unclear. They said, "The spirits of the mountains are testing us. The forest does not wish to harm people, but it will not protect those who remain still for too long." That sentence became a guiding truth for the Dao people for thousands of years. To live is to keep moving forward, even if the path leads to towering peaks or bottomless valleys. After 7 days and nights, with the sickness still spreading, the sons of Ban Vuong understood that they could no longer remain in their ancestral land. It was the hardest decision they had ever made, for that place was their beginning, the birthplace of legend, where every rock bore the mark of their forefather. But if they stayed, their entire people would be buried with the dreams that had only just begun to grow. And so they prepared for what would become the first journey in the history of Dao migration. The entire village stood before the ancient forest, its towering trees like ancient gods watching their every move. Children were carried on backs, elders leaned on walking sticks, and the young brought only a few supplies: dried food, tobacco, and sacred objects from their ancestors. They did not carry much, only what was necessary to survive, and what could never be left behind: the flame, the ancient prayers, and the belief that Ban Vuong was walking ahead of them, leading the way. The legend says that on the final night before their departure, a strong wind swept through, but instead of extinguishing the flames in their hands, it made them burn even brighter, glowing red, as if to say they were on the right path. The Dao call this the sign of Ban Vuong. Their journey began with hesitant steps, but the farther they went, the more they realized that the destiny of their people did not lie within a single valley or forest. It lived in the courage to leave behind what was familiar and venture into lands unknown. They crossed mountain ranges so high that one wrong step could send them plunging into endless ravines. They forded great rivers, where the current was so strong it could knock over even the strongest of men. But whenever someone stumbled, there were always 2 or 3 others ready to lift them up. No one was ever left behind. After many weeks of travel, they finally arrived at a new land that opened up before their eyes, mountains that were softer, valleys that were wider, and soil that was richer and more fertile. This would become the first settlement of the Dao people outside their ancestral land. But they had no idea that this place was only the beginning of centuries of migration, leading them from one region to another, southward, westward, and eventually all the way to the distant United States. When the Dao first set foot on this new land, they found themselves standing before a vast valley, surrounded by mist-covered, gently sloping hills. There were no more towering cliffs or deadly, poisoned streams. This land felt like a gift from the heavens, offered to those who had endured the hardships of the journey. The soil was soft and easy to cultivate. The water was clear, with schools of fish swimming freely. The forest was thick, yet peaceful, no longer echoing with the threatening growls they had grown used to. As they stepped into the heart of the valley, the eldest among them spoke words that made everyone fall silent. Our ancestors want us to begin a new era here. It was on this land that the first foundations of Dao culture took shape. They built houses along the slopes of the mountains, just as they had in the ancestral legends. But this time, each home was larger and sturdier. The young men carved wood using sharpened stone tools, while the women wove thatched roofs from long golden grasses that shimmered in the sunlight. Within just a few months, a small village emerged, resting like a precious gem nestled in the forest. At night, the firelight from their rooftops rose into the sky, forming a glowing red band across the darkness, like a sacred belt. And from that moment on, the color red became a powerful symbol for the Dao. They believe it protects them from evil spirits, wards off disease, and reminds them of the eternal fire of Vuong. In this very first settlement, ancient rituals began to take on structure and form. It was here that the chants of the Mo masters were first written down, using an early form of Dao script, elegant, intricate, and deeply symbolic. Many Americans today do not realize that the Dao people have their own writing system, developed thousands of years ago and passed down by hand from generation to generation. These ancient texts are more than rituals. They are spiritual maps, guiding the Dao in how to live, how to eat, how to worship, and how to respect the natural world. When read aloud, the rhythm echoes like the voice of the mountains and forests combined, so deeply resonant that even Dao children born in America can feel the heartbeat of their ancestors in every word. During their time here, the Dao also created the most distinctive clothing of their culture. They used indigo-dyed fabric as the base, but always embroidered it with brilliant red threads. Every pattern, every stitch tells a story. Some speak of the journey across mountains, others recall the great plague of the past, and many honor the sacred fire that never dies. Whenever a Dao child wears that outfit, they are not just putting on clothes, they are wearing the very history of their people. That peaceful valley allowed the Dao people to flourish. But just as they were beginning to grow comfortable in their new life, troubling signs began to appear. The stream grew murky, the sounds of wild animals echoed closer, and the night sky no longer shone as brightly as before. The Mo masters sensed that the balance between humans and the forest was shifting. And according to ancient customs, when nature no longer smiles, it is time for the people to prepare for another journey. It was also from this settlement that the Dao first heard whispers of lands farther south, vast, fertile, and less threatened by wild beasts. It was the call of destiny, opening the next chapter of migration that would lead them into what is now Vietnam, then Laos, and centuries later to Thailand and even across the ocean to the United States. Leaving that valley was a decision that many Dao would carry in their hearts for the rest of their lives. So many children had been born there. So many elders had laid down their walking sticks and found rest on that very soil. So many prayers, stories, and memories had become part of the streams and mountain peaks. But the Dao have an unbreakable vow. If the land changes, the people must change their path. When the signs of imbalance appear, they believe it is the ancestors reminding them, never fall into slumber. The muddy water is not just stirred by sand and stone, it is the forest sending a warning. The sounds of beasts in the night are not by chance. They are the heartbeat of nature, urging them to move before it is too late. On the final night in the valley, the whole village gathered around the largest fire. The flames lit up faces filled with sorrow. but also with determination. The oldest member raised the ancestral staff and spoke with a voice raspy but strong. "We did not choose this journey. The journey chose us. And since Vuong created the world, the Tao have never turned back halfway." At that moment, soft sobs rose in the air, but then came silence. A silence as heavy as a mountain pressing down on their hearts, yet just as powerful as the will that has carried them through time. The next morning, as the sun barely peeked over the ridge, the Tao began to pack. No one brought heavy things. They carried only fire, a few pieces of red-embroidered cloth, wooden prayer tablets inscribed with words for their ancestors, and seeds they believed would take root in the next land. Children were carried on backs wrapped in red cloth, adorned with sacred patterns. Mothers tied red scarves around their heads to pray for peace. The men carried sacred items, horns, small bells, and scrolls filled with the words of the ancestors. These were not just supplies. They were the memories of an entire people. As they left the village, they turned back for one last look. The valley was covered in morning mist, as beautiful as a dream fading away. The stream shimmered in the light, as if nature itself was saying goodbye through its tears. And then, the line of people began to move forward, forming a red trail winding around the mountain's edge. The sound of their footsteps blended with the wind and rustling leaves, creating the music of a new journey. A sound that generations of Tao, even those living today in California or Minnesota, can still imagine during every Capsack ceremony or New Year celebration. They moved southward, crossing massive forests that today are part of Yunnan, China. These forests were so vast that even after walking for an entire month, they still could not see the edge. At night, they lit fires. Elders told stories of Vuong, and the children drifted off to sleep to the sound of wind howling through the treetops. By day, they climbed over mountain passes, forded streams, listened to the calls of jungle birds, avoided wild beasts, and ate whatever they could find: bamboo shoots, wild fruits, and sometimes just a few roots to chew on and push back the hunger. But no one complained. They understood that their people were born from the journey, and that it was the journey itself that protected them from extinction. After many months of nonstop travel, the Tao began to reach lower lands, with warmer climates and wider rivers. This was the threshold that led them to places that would later become their most important homelands: Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Each new land opened like a new chapter in their history, filled with both hope and hardship. As the Tao descended into these lower regions, they began to recognize signs their ancestors had once described: gentle chains of green mountains, warmer air, and great rivers stretching like silver ribbons across the valleys. Scouts who had gone ahead reported back that farther south lay a vast, fertile land where the forests were less fierce, the water was no longer bitter cold, and the sunlight touched the earth with a comforting warmth. This was the land that would later become ancient Vietnam, the place where the Tao would first set foot on a journey that would span centuries. When they entered this new land, they sensed something different: another kind of life, a new rhythm. The forests were still thick, the streams still deep, but nature had a gentleness they had never known before. Small fields appeared along the streams, signs that other people had once lived there. But the Tao did not come to conquer. It has never been in their nature to invade or dominate. They chose instead to blend in, to move deeper into the forests, to build their villages where the mountains could protect them. In doing so, they preserved their way of life while avoiding unnecessary conflict. The first Tao village in what is now Vietnam was built high on a mountainside, where each morning the clouds floated at eye level. This was the land later known as the Northern Highlands, a place perfectly suited for the Tao to create a new life. They carved terraced rice fields into the slopes, built winding paths around the mountain, planted upland rice and corn. They constructed stilt houses from fragrant po mu wood with thin roofs that still held strong against wind and storm. At night, the firelight from the village rose up into the trees, glowing like stars being born from the earth. Here, the Tao people developed customs that would later become some of their most iconic traditions. The Capsack initiation ceremony, ancestral worship, red embroidery rituals, and the love songs that echo through the mountains and forests. The brilliance of Tao clothing truly began to shine during this time. Dao women sat before their embroidery frames, each stitched through the fabric like a continuation of the story of their people. Every pattern held a memory. Zigzag lines represented the mountains they had crossed. Circles symbolized the moon guiding their night marches. And red squares stood for the ancestral fire passed down from the time of Ban Vuong. What made the Dao people in Vietnam truly remarkable was their ability to turn the rugged mountains into a safe and nurturing home. They understood the forest better than anyone. They knew when the animals would come to drink at the stream, when the toxic mist would roll in, which leaves could calm a fever, and which roots could save a life in times of hunger. They lived with the mountains, not against them, and it was this spirit that helped them survive countless upheavals in history. As time passed, the Dao became part of this land. But their destiny was never to remain still. Natural disasters, shifting climates, and rising tensions between ethnic groups pushed them to keep moving, deeper into the highlands, into what is now Laos and Thailand. With every step, they left a cultural footprint on the map of Southeast Asia. Still, the road was far from easy. There were nights when lives were lost in the forest, days when hunger struck after floods wiped out their crops, and winters so cold that every breath froze in midair. But whenever someone fell, the others would light incense, recite prayers to their ancestors, and rise to keep moving. They did not carry Ban Vuong only in their memory. They carried the strength of their ancestors in every breath. As the Dao continued southward, crossing endless chains of mountains, their journey entered a new phase, a phase of expansion, a time when their identity deepened more than at any other point in their history. The first groups went ahead to find land. Others followed, forming trails winding along mountain ridges, paths so well worn that hundreds of years later, people could still see the footprints of their ancestors etched into the stone. From the northern mountains of Vietnam, they spread out like birds searching for new nests. One group moved west into Laos, another went southwest into Thailand. The rest remained in Vietnam, building strong communities that would last for generations. The Dao first reached Laos by crossing towering mountain passes that brushed against the clouds. Wandering among majestic ranges, they discovered small valleys, gentle streams, and land suitable for new villages. In Laos, they brought their ancient rituals, their vibrant ceremonial chants, and their love songs that made the forests echo with their voices. The Lao people saw their brilliant red garments, witnessed their tireless spirit, and admired their unbreakable will. And soon they began calling them with respect, the children of the mountains. The Dao did not seek conflict, nor did they ever impose their customs on others. But within just a few years, Dao villages began to appear, bright red dots standing out against the deep green of the jungle, becoming part of the cultural landscape of Laos. In Thailand, the journey became even more challenging. The forests here were denser and more treacherous, and the hot, humid climate made illness more common. Yet the Dao were the people who understood the language of the forest better than anyone. They cleared paths by observing the trails of animals, chose where to build their villages based on the direction of the wind, and used hundreds of forest plants to heal themselves. The Thai people witnessed their endurance, saw how they protected one another, how each village functioned like a living organism, united, connected, with no one left behind. The Dao became a respected community, known by different local names, yet always preserving the cultural roots they had carried with them. In Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, the Dao people shared one common trait. They always chose the high mountains, where the sun rose slower, where the clouds rolled in faster, and where only the strong could survive. This harsh environment sharpened their spirit, purified their soul, and made the red of their clothing shine even more brightly. One generation followed another. One village connected to the next, and within just a few generations, the Dao had become one of the largest ethnic communities in the region, spread across several countries, yet astonishingly united in their customs, language, and ancestral faith. During this era, the Kapsak ceremony, the most important ritual of the Dao, reached its most refined form. On the nights of Kapsak, the whole village glowed with firelight. Mo masters chanted from ancient books, young men danced, and children watched with eyes full of wonder, knowing that one day they too would be guided onto the sacred path of their ancestors. To the Tao, Kapsak is not just a rite of passage, it is the spiritual cord that ties their soul to Ban Vuong. It is the seal that ensures no matter where they go, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, or later even to the United States, they will remain Tao, carrying within them the eternal flame that never dies. And it was during this golden age that the first signs of great upheaval began to appear. War, famine, exhausted land, and social change forced many Tao to leave their villages in search of a new future. Some set off for neighboring countries. Others crossed borders in the night with nothing but a red cloth bundle in their hands. And generations later, their descendants would become the first Tao to set foot on American soil, bringing with them the weight of this entire history in every breath they take. The golden age of the Tao in Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand did not last forever. Just as the terraced fields began to thrive, just as the sound of flutes and songs echoed through the old forests, the winds of change began to creep into their villages. It was no longer the mysterious misfortunes of their ancestors' time, but human-made forces, invisible, yet powerful enough to uproot an entire people from the place they once called home. It began with the changes in the forest. Once vast, abundant with wildlife and rich in fertile soil, the forest slowly began to thin over generations as humans cleared more land. The soil lost its strength. Sudden floods came, washing away fields and crops. The Tao people, who had always depended on the mountains and forests, began to feel the change deeply. They heard the forest winds shift in tone, the streams rushing louder than before, and saw clouds carrying omens their ancestors had warned about. When the forest changes, the people must prepare to move. But this time, they were not only walking because of nature. A new, stronger force was coming: war, famine, and conflicts that would redraw the map of Southeast Asia. As the drums of war echoed from the north, the Tao felt danger, not only to their land, but to their very way of life. They had never been a people of war. They built no castles. They had no desire to conquer. All they ever wanted was to live quietly among the mountains and trees. But war gave them no choice. Villages that had once been peaceful became places of refuge for those fleeing conflict, and then were caught themselves in the chaos of hunger and disorder. Once again, the Tao had to move. But this time, it was not a search for new land. It was a search to escape pain and destruction. In Vietnam, many Tao villages retreated to higher of more remote mountains. In Laos and Thailand, they followed hidden forest paths, seeking regions less affected by war. Families and clans split apart, like streams flowing around stones, each taking a different direction, yet still carrying the same current, the memory of their ancestors. Some groups walked for 3 months just to find temporary shelter. Some families were divided across 3 different countries, promising only to reunite when the peaceful valley returns, though no one knew when that would be. And then the modern era began. It was a time of the greatest upheavals in Southeast Asia: world wars, regional conflicts, and political changes that forced thousands of Tao to leave their villages once again. But this time, they were no longer moving within the mountains of Southeast Asia. They began to hear of faraway lands, places that promised peace and a future. Places without bombs, where children could go to school, where their identity could survive without fear. This marked the first era of transcontinental migration for the Tao. Some moved from Laos to Thailand to seek safety in refugee camps. Others crossed the borders from Vietnam into neighboring countries in search of refuge. And from these refugee camps, many Tao families became the first to set foot in the United States, opening a brand new chapter in their people's history. A chapter of integration, resilience, and preserving identity in a completely different world. A new chapter began with the first airplanes that carried them from refugee camps to California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, New York. Places their ancestors had never spoken of, yet the Tao brought with them one unchanging thing: the red color of their ancestral fire. Their journey to America did not begin with grand dreams or a desire to chase a better life, as it did for many others. For the Tao, it began with just one thing: survival. As regional wars pushed them into the most remote borderlands, countless families were forced to leave their villages, trekking through forests by night, carrying their children, their ancestral prayer books, a few red-embroidered garments, and the sacred flame cradled in a small bamboo lantern. Many had no idea where they were going or what lay ahead. They only knew that if they stayed, they would lose everything: their land, their family, and the soul of their people. The refugee camps in Thailand became temporary shelters. There, the Dao lived in cramped tents, lacking even the most basic needs. But what was remarkable was that even in such hardship, when 3 people shared a single bowl of rice, they still lit incense each night, whispering prayers for their ancestors to protect them. Amid the dust and the cries of children, the Dao still sang old songs. They still embroidered red threads as if each stitch was a lifeline holding them back from despair. It was those years in exile that unknowingly forged an inner strength, one that every Dao person raised in America would later feel. No matter how much the world changes, the Dao never lose their roots. Then the opportunity came. A few countries agreed to resettle refugees, and among them was the United States. The Dao were called, name by name, to prepare for the first flights of their lives. They had never seen airplanes before. They had never imagined cities with buildings that touched the sky. But they went. They did not speak English. They had no idea how cold American winters would be. They had no clue what life would be like across the ocean. But they carried what mattered most: the memory and pride of their people. On the day the plane took off, many Dao pressed their faces to the windows, watching the mountains and forests of Southeast Asia shrink and blur into the clouds. No one spoke. Each held a private longing, a silent message to their ancestors. We are not abandoning the forest. We are leaving so that we may live. Some mothers held their children tightly, afraid that the long flight might steal away the last warmth of home from their shoulders. Some elders trembled as they touched their embroidered cloth pouches, inside which were prayer sheets carried from their ancestral land. And up there in the vast sky, for the first time in thousands of years, the Dao people left Asia behind. When they set foot in the United States, they were overwhelmed. Streetlights were so bright, it felt as if hundreds of artificial suns lit up the night. Cars roared by like rivers of steel. People spoke a language they did not understand and ate foods they had never seen. The weather was so harsh that winters in Minnesota reminded them of the biting cold atop the mountains of Sunla. But this time, there were no forests to shield them, no jungle fire to keep them warm. Yet in that strangeness, the Dao did what their ancestors had always done throughout history. They rebuilt their village. Not a wooden village in the forest, but a community. They lived near each other, helped one another find housing, find work. Those who spoke English taught those who did not. The young guided the elderly to buy essentials. They built small ancestral shrines from American pine, but inside, they still placed red garments, still hung bells and drums, and still worshipped in the ways of their forefathers. In California, Dao communities grew large. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, they adapted to the cold, living in small neighborhoods filled with the laughter of children. They no longer lived on mountaintops, but they still lived with the spirit of the mountains. And the miracle is this: even the children born in America, who had never set foot in Vietnam, Laos, or Thailand, still knew how to sing Dao songs, still wore red garments during the New Year, still bowed before the ancestral altar, and spoke chants that not even American history books had ever heard. That identity was never lost. It simply moved to a new home. The second generation of Dao in America grew up in a world completely different from their parents. These children opened their eyes not to the sound of forest winds or streams flowing over rocks, but to the noise of traffic and the sterile lights of American hospitals. They grew up in neighborhoods where winter covered the streets in snow, where summer cracked the skin with heat, never knowing the feeling of bare feet on mountain soil or the songs of insects in pitch-black nights. Yet within each child, something remained unchanged: the red bloodline, like the embroidery thread passed down from the ancestors. Dao children in America started school early. They learned English so quickly, it surprised their parents. They blended into American culture with ease, playing basketball, watching Hollywood movies, eating hamburgers and pizza like any other kid. But there was one thing that could never be separated from them: their name. Dao names carried sharp, bold sounds, etched with the essence of the mountains and forests. American teachers sometimes stumbled over pronouncing them, but the children stood tall and replied proudly, "That is my name." Dao names are never borrowed. They are unerasable marks of identity. By day, they studied English, science, and math. At night, back home, they sat watching their parents embroider, listening to grandparents tell forest stories about Ban Vuong, about the ancestral flame, about the journey through Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. These stories made two worlds live inside their small hearts. One modern and glowing with artificial light, and another ancient, filled with spiritual power, drums, the color red, and the soul of the mountains. Many young Dao later shared that this made them always feel different. But that difference was not shame. It was treasure, a kind of richness not every American child could ever know. The first generation, the fathers and mothers who once lived in refugee camps, always feared that their children would forget their roots. But that fear slowly faded as they watched their children put on Dao garments during the new year, stand before the ancestral altar, and recite prayers, sometimes with pronunciation even more precise than their own. During major holidays, the entire Dao community in California or Minnesota would gather in large halls. The sound of drums echoed, ancient songs were sung, and traditional dances mesmerized even native-born Americans who stood in awe, asking, "A people from the deep forests of Asia preserved a culture this beautiful?" The Dao in America did not just preserve their identity, they built something new. Many opened shops, started businesses, became engineers, nurses, entrepreneurs. They integrated into American society, but were never swept away by it. Their success did not come from abandoning their roots, but from standing firmly on the foundation of their ancestral story. They understood better than anyone that they were living a new chapter, but to write it beautifully, they had to remember the first pages written in the distant mountains of Vietnam and Laos. And then came the third generation, children with brown hair, bright eyes, and flawless American accents. And the miracle happened again. They still wore red scarves during ceremonies, still called Ban Vuong their ancestor, and still felt proud when hearing the story of their people's journey. Some of them returned to Vietnam to visit their ancestral land, stood before the terraced rice fields in villages perched atop lonely mountains, and cried without knowing why. It turns out that no matter how many generations pass, no matter how many miles they travel, the Dao spirit always finds its way back home. Assimilating into American life was never easy for the Dao. Behind the bright lights of California's roads, behind the towering buildings of Minnesota, behind the bustling neighborhoods of Wisconsin, lay the daily struggles faced by the first generation. They did not understand English, were unfamiliar with the laws, did not know how to navigate a complex society, and sometimes did not even know how to use simple household appliances. But in this foreign land, the Dao once again revealed the strength that had carried them through thousands of years. The ability to adapt without losing their soul. The elderly Dao, when they first arrived in America, often felt like they were lost in a forest larger than any they had ever crossed. Here, there were no bird songs, no wind whispering through bamboo, no familiar scent of wood smoke from a kitchen fire. Only the constant roar of traffic and the glow of artificial lights made them feel small. One person once said, "Coming to America is like stepping into a world with no trails. You have to find your own." And they did, by watching, by learning, and with the same resilience that helped their ancestors cross mountains and rivers. Many of the first Dao in America worked in meatpacking plants, garment factories, farms, or other forms of hard labor. They did not speak English, but they spoke in another way, with their hands. 12-hour days, sometimes 16, but they never complained. They had once lived in forests, endured cold, faced hunger, and survived nights when death was just one misstep away. So no matter how harsh America was, it could not break their will. The inner strength of the Dao was something America never expected. But the hardest challenge did not come from work. It came from the invisible wall between two cultures. The Dao honored tradition, revered their ancestors, and placed family at the center, while American culture emphasized individualism and freedom. Older Dao did not understand why their children dared to argue with teachers, or why they wanted to live like Americans. At the same time, Dao children often felt uncomfortable trying to explain to American friends why their parents burned incense every night, or why they were not allowed to choose a romantic partner freely at a young age. This tension did not lead to division. Instead, it created a space of intersection. a place where the Tao had to learn to stand firmly between two worlds. Parents learned English slowly but steadily. Children absorbed American culture quickly, but were taught to remember their roots. Tao families created unspoken agreements. Out in the world, children could blend in, but at home, they must show respect to elders, celebrate the new year, wear Tao clothes, and remember the stories of Vuong and the forest. Americans sometimes looked at the Tao with curiosity, sometimes with confusion, and at times with prejudice. But when they saw Tao communities working hard, living peacefully, staying close-knit, and preserving their culture with quiet strength, they began to respect them. Many Americans have stood for hours to watch a capsack ceremony, to listen to a Tao song echo through the air, or to admire the dazzling red garments that look like living paintings of history. They came to understand that the Tao were not just refugees. They were carriers of a cultural treasure the world rarely sees. And from those early struggles, the Tao community in America began to thrive. Many opened businesses, stores, restaurants, nail salons, even companies. Their children became doctors, engineers, teachers, soldiers. They were both American and Tao, and they did not have to choose between the two. They carried both worlds in the same heart, and that is what made them extraordinary. As the early hardships began to fade, the Tao community in America started to write a new chapter, a chapter no longer centered on survival, but on building, growing, and claiming their place in this vast country. They stepped out of small apartment buildings, out of backbreaking labor, out of days filled with fear and uncertainty, into a new era where, for the first time, the Tao could truly see a future ahead of them. The second generation, the children born in America, began to achieve things their parents had never dreamed possible. They went to college, became nurses, engineers, doctors, soldiers, teachers, even joined government agencies and community organizations. The Tao have long been known for their resilience, their hard work, their thirst for knowledge. And when those qualities met the opportunities of America, they blossomed into accomplishments worth celebrating. In California, many Tao families opened small businesses, convenience stores, restaurants, and later, larger enterprises. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Tao built agricultural communities, farmed, traded, and adapted to the cold climate that had now become familiar. Many Tao serving in the U.S. military have fought overseas, carrying the American flag but keeping in their hearts the beat of the capsack drum and the name of Ban Vuong. These stories are shared throughout the community as proof that the Tao can travel far without losing themselves. But the greatest achievement is not found in careers or wealth. It lies in cultural continuity. In America, the Tao have no mountains to climb, no forests to hunt, no misty villages like in Vietnam, Laos, or Thailand. But they have created new cultural spaces, spiritual villages within modern society. Every weekend, elders gather in community centers to teach children how to embroider, how to sing, how to read ancestral texts. Capsack ceremonies are still held, just as solemn as they were back home. The vivid red garments are still crafted with care, every stitch preserved to match what the ancestors taught. Many Americans, witnessing these rituals, have said, "Here in the United States, I feel like I'm standing in another world, a beautiful world we've never seen before." And they are right. The Tao carry a culture that is not diluted, not dimmed by time or distance. In fact, placed within a completely different environment, it shines even brighter, like a splash of red against the white snow of Minnesota. Even more remarkable is the third and fourth generations, Tao children who speak perfect American English, who may not fully understand the Tao language. But when they wear their traditional clothes, when they enter the New Year celebration hall, when they hear the drums beat, they feel something indescribable. A force, invisible yet powerful, pulling them back to a homeland they have never lived in, but have always belonged to. They ask their parents, their grandparents, "Am I Tao?" And when they hear the answer, "Yes, you are," their eyes light up as if they've just discovered a missing piece of who they are. They begin learning the old songs, how to hold a needle and stitch the red patterns, the meaning of every motif, every prayer, every ritual. They listen to stories of Ban Vuong, of the journey through forests and mountains, of the path that brought their people to America. All of it becomes a fire, not only of the past, but of the future. In the mosaic of ethnicities that is America, the Tao are a unique shade. They are not large in number, not loud, not flashy, but they are resilient, connected, united, and proud in their own quiet way. They build families, preserve traditions, contribute to American society, and all the while, they hold tight to the spirit of the mountains and forests in every rhythm of their lives. As the Tao community in America enters its time of maturity, they no longer think only of preserving culture within their own homes. They begin to think bigger. How can Tao culture not only survive but thrive, be seen, recognized, and respected in a country of hundreds of other cultures? And from that question, a new movement has emerged, a wave of Tao cultural leaders. The second and third generations have realized that if they do not record the ancestral prayers, the stories of Ban Vuong, the love songs, and the ancient embroidery patterns, then one day, when the elders are gone, the entire cultural treasure might vanish like mist on a mountaintop. So they began to do something their ancestors never had the chance to do. They began recording, filming, writing, digitizing the legacy of their people. In California, a group of young Tao began filming each ancestral chant with modern cameras. They translated each line, asking their elders again and again to make sure no word was mistaken. They held bells, drums, and flutes in front of the camera, explaining the meaning of each one. These videos were then shared online, drawing thousands of Tao viewers across the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe. For the first time in history, the Tao across the world could see each other, hear each other, and feel their shared culture without having to cross thousands of miles of forest as their ancestors once did. In Minnesota, where winter blankets the world in white, the Tao have begun organizing festivals grander than ever before. Tao identity no longer lives only in small homes, but now takes center stage in public, multicultural arenas. The sound of the cap-sack drum echoes through cold auditoriums, leaving white, black, and Hispanic Americans silent, awestruck by the power of such a vibrant culture. Bright red garments line the stage, their embroidered patterns projected onto giant screens, like fragments of ancestral soul shining in the heart of the 21st century. Many Tao have begun producing documentaries, interviewing elders who recount their journeys through the jungle, across borders, and across oceans. These stories are now being shown at universities, cultural centers, and recognized by American scholars as an important part of immigration history. Some Tao academics have even written theses and research books about their own people, something that had never happened in thousands of years. The Tao are now writing their own story, instead of waiting for someone else to write it for them. In Wisconsin and North Carolina, free classes in the Tao script have been opened. Tao children, kids who speak English more fluently than their mother tongue, practice pronouncing the complex square characters of their ancestors. Some write them incorrectly, some write them backwards, but the elders patiently correct each stroke, knowing that every word preserved is a piece of heritage saved from vanishing. In the digital age, the Tao have gone even further. They have built websites, apps, and online libraries to store and share their ancestral prayers, folk tales, migration maps, customs, songs, and even traditional embroidery techniques. What was once passed down only by word of mouth is now preserved through technology, becoming a digital flame that continues the fire lit by Ban Vuong generations ago. The Tao have also begun organizing major cultural competitions, traditional costume embroidery contests, singing contests, storytelling events, cooking competitions. Community halls fill with laughter, songs, and the voices of three generations: grandparents, parents, and children. And in those moments, the Tao in America are no longer a separate group. They are a vibrant thread in the rich cultural tapestry of the United States. Their resilience, unity, and cultural strength have led Americans to see the Tao not as immigrants, not as former refugees, but as an ethnic group with a soul full of fire, a people who never fall, who never lose themselves, no matter how far they travel. Within every Tao community in America, there are individuals whose stories can bring anyone to silence. They are small pieces of a greater whole, but each piece holds a universe of its own, a rugged past, a determined present, and a future lit by the legacy of their ancestors. When these stories are told, Tao people everywhere see themselves in them. They see the mountains and forests, they see the sacred fire, they see the journey over rivers and peaks that still runs in their veins. An elderly Tao man once shared that, on his first day in America, he knew only one sentence in English: "Thank you." He worked in a cold meat processing plant where the temperature was so low that his hands went numb every morning. He was unfamiliar with the machines, the automated systems, even the smell of disinfectants in the factory. But hardship was something he knew well. He had crossed jungles at night, fled the sound of gunfire, carried his children through floodwaters. So the cold of the factory did not scare him. He worked 14 hours a day, saving every dollar, sending money back to help his family in Vietnam, and raising 3 children in America. Those 3 children would later become a software engineer, a nurse, and a teacher. When his daughter stood confidently to speak at her college graduation, he cried. Not from pride, but from the realization that his people had not bowed to fate. In Minnesota, a second-generation Tao girl became an embroidery artist. Born in America, she spoke English better than Tao, but dedicated her youth to studying traditional patterns. She interviewed dozens of elders, recorded every ancient stitch, every story hidden in the designs. She turned those stitches into paintings, into fashion, into exhibitions. Americans stood in front of her work as if reading a living history book. And she said, "I do not embroider fabric. I embroider memory." In Wisconsin, a young Tao man once felt like he belonged nowhere. At school, his American classmates saw him as different. At home, he felt disconnected from his parents' language. He often asked himself, "Who am I, American or Tao?" Then one day, during a community capsack ceremony, he heard the drumbeat. The sound cut through his modern clothes, through generations of memory, and struck him in the heart. He shared, "For the first time in my life, I realized I do not have to choose. I am both. I am a tree with 2 roots, one in America and one in the ancestral mountains." He later became the head of a major Tao cultural organization, connecting thousands of Tao people across the United States. In California, many Tao families run nail salons, working from sunrise to night. But they still preserve every tradition. At night, they light incense for their ancestors. On weekends, they teach their children how to embroider. They celebrate the new year so vibrantly that even their American neighbors come to watch. One American once said, "You are a small community, but you have the biggest heart I have ever seen." Each of these stories is just one page in the thick book of the Tao in America. Some succeed publicly, others live quietly. Some stand on big stages, others simply raise children and keep traditions alive in small homes. But they all share one thing in common. They never forget the forest. The forest in their minds, in their memories, in the stories they tell their children and grandchildren. The young generation today grows up surrounded by technology, by smartphones, by a virtual digital world. But when they see their grandparents wearing red attire, when they hear the ancestral drums, when they are told that their ancestors once crossed mountains and forests, survived wars and famine, then crossed the ocean, they understand that they have inherited an incomparable heritage. In an age where the whole world fits inside a phone, the Tao in America realize that if they want to preserve their culture for children growing up with TikTok, YouTube, Netflix, they must bring their culture into the digital space. And so the traditional Tao stage is no longer just a community hall or a clearing in front of the ancestral shrine. It expands into the phone screen, into videos with millions of views, into stories shared not only among Tao, but to the world. Young Tao began to hold cameras, adjust lighting, edit videos, and tell their people's story in ways that young people can receive. They film the bright red embroidered costumes, explain each motif like unlocking a door to the past. They record their elders chanting ancestral prayers, explaining the meaning of initiation ceremonies, of New Year festivals, of the sacred red color. When these videos are posted on TikTok, many Americans who had never heard of the Tao leave comments filled with wonder. Why have I never known a culture this beautiful before? Young Tao understand that if their ancestors preserved their culture with flame, with drums, with forest paths, they preserve it now with technology, with images, with digital sound. Some create YouTube channels specifically documenting Tao rituals. Others open Instagram pages posting photos of traditional clothes, attracting tens of thousands of followers from all over the world. Some become filmmakers, bringing the Tao migration story to American television. The most beautiful thing is, these efforts do not dilute Tao culture, they deepen it. A 70-year-old elder in California can rewatch a traditional Tao dance from Laos thanks to a video online. A Tao child born in Wisconsin can relearn an old song from a Facebook post. A young Tao student in New York can read ancestral stories from a PDF stored on a community website. Everything that once stood at risk of disappearing in the mountains and forests is now preserved with technology, more sustainable, more far-reaching, and never forgotten. It is these very digital platforms that help Tao people around the world find each other. Tao in Australia connect with Tao in Canada. Tao in France talk with Tao in Laos. They share photos of initiation ceremonies, share how to cook traditional dishes, share their language and their stories. A people who once had to cross deep forests to find each other now only need a tap on a screen to reconnect with their extended family. They told me, it is not always easy. Modern technology also brings new challenges. How to make sure the younger generation does not treat Tao culture as mere content, but as a part of themselves. Some young Tao once said, I like watching Tao videos, but I do not know if I truly belong to that culture. That question troubled many of the elders. And because of it, the Tao community began to organize bigger events, giving the younger generation a more active role, so that they not only watch, but live the culture with their whole being. Now, Tao festivals in America involve all three generations. Grandparents guide, parents prepare, children perform. Modern Tao music shows combine traditional instruments with contemporary beats on wide stages. Many young Tao become a unique fusion. They wear the red garments, tie on the traditional scarves, yet they rap in Tao language over American-style beats, creating a new style that fills the community with pride. In the digital age, the Tao do not simply preserve their culture. They renew it, beautify it, amplify it in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. As though Vuong, the one who once raised mountains and directed rivers, now watches his descendants build new digital mountains, extending the history of their people into the future. In the vast, ever-turning United States, the Tao still hold on to their oldest values, values that cannot be seen with the eyes, but which form the foundation that has kept them standing strong for thousands of years. Those values, ancestral faith, belief in Vuong's guidance, the bond between humans and the mountain spirit, and strangely, in a modern environment full of neon lights and LED screens, those values do not fade. Rather, they become even more sacred. In every city where Tao people settle, whether Fresno, Sacramento, Minneapolis, or Milwaukee, there is a small house regarded as a family ancestral altar. The Tao do not need a grand temple or a lavish shrine. They only need a simple wooden altar where a few bells rest, a red embroidered garment, some incense sticks, and a prayer slip passed down through generations. But to them, that altar is a bridge between America and their ancient origin deep in the mountains of Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Each time they light incense, they do not only summon their ancestors, they call upon the forest paths, the mountain peaks, the initiation ceremonies, the drums of their childhood. Within Tao families, New Year's celebrations never vanish. On the first day of the new year, every household wears brilliant red Tao clothes, eats traditional cakes, visits relatives as though they were living in a highland village in Asia. The children born in America, even if they speak English all day, are still taught how to bow before the ancestral altar, how to fold their hands when the shaman reads the ancient scrolls. They might not fully understand the meaning at first, but they feel the solemnity. They feel something larger than themselves, an undercurrent of culture flowing from the sky to the earth, from ancestors to descendants. The Capsack ceremony, the most sacred ritual of the Tao, is still held regularly in the United States. When the modern lights fade and only the golden glow of candles remains, the drums echo and the Mo shaman's voice rises with chants as long and resonant as a call from the creation time. Young Tao people, born on American soil, but with eyes that reflect the mountains, sit upright before the ancestral altar, waiting to be entrusted with the sacred flame. And in the moment they receive their capsack, they recognize who they are. They are not just American citizens, not just the younger generation. They are a living link in a long chain of history stretching from Vuong to today. What makes the Tao stand out is that they do not treat their culture as something to show off, nor their rituals as a spectacle. To them, every ceremony is a way to connect souls: the soul of a person, the soul of ancestors, the soul of ancient mountains and forests, and the souls of all Tao who perished along the journey through forests across seas. There are ancestral worship rituals performed in small apartments in the heart of American cities while traffic roars outside. But when the Mo begins to chant, the little living room transforms. It becomes an ancient village, the drum sounds echoing as though through deep forests thousands of miles away. Those ancient values shine in their solidarity. Even though Tao people in America live scattered across many states, they still look to one another as family. When someone is in trouble, the entire community responds. When there is a major ceremony, people gather, even if they must travel hundreds of miles. That spirit is the greatest legacy left by their forebears. The spirit of people who once crossed mountains without leaving anyone behind, who once crossed raging rivers together, who once crossed seas side by side. Even while integrating into American society, the Tao keep humility, value family deeply, honor the elders, and raise their children with old traditions. On quiet evenings, when the city lights outside dim behind the windows, they light incense at their small ancestral altar. The smoke drifts upward, thin and light like mountain mist. But it carries a reminder that no matter where they are, no matter how they live, Tao people always have a common home in their souls. To understand why the Tao have survived for thousands of years, from the time Vuong created the world, through ancient mountains and forests, savage wars, knights crossing borders in darkness, to flying half the globe to America, we must return to their deepest root: spiritual faith. Not fleeting beliefs or borrowed rituals, but a sacred, enduring bond so strong that even time cannot fade it. The Tao believe that each person is not just a body, but a continuation of hundreds of generations. When a Tao child is born, the elders in the family always say, "This is the child the ancestors sent." That means the child belongs not just to the small family, but to the entire clan, to the whole people, to the spirits of the mountains and forest. And it is that belief which creates a strange kind of strength. Even when their lives are steeped in poverty, driven by war, or swept away by modern times, they still know where they come from, a question not all peoples can answer clearly. Their origins begin in the chaos of creation, when Vuong raised the mountains, led the rivers, ignited the first fire for humankind. The Tao do not see Vuong as a distant deity, but as their forefather, the head of the greatest clan, protector of descendants, even if they wander all the way to the west. And because they regard their ancestors as the starting point, the Tao believe that every step their descendants take is under the watchful eyes of those departed souls. The connection between life and death, between past and present, forms a spiritual current that never breaks. On the outside, the Tao may seem just like a small minority community, but inside them lies a cultural universe, connected to their ancestors through rituals, to nature through ceremonies, to each other through faith. And what makes them strong is that this faith does not rest on power or material wealth, but on memory and gratitude. When their ancestors crossed mountains and forests, they prayed for the forest's protection. When they were surrounded by plague, they asked ancestors to guide them. When war forced them to flee with children on their backs, they called on Vuong like calling a light in the darkness. And when they reached America, a totally foreign land, they placed their ancestral altar in a small apartment like that, setting a spiritual milestone, reminding themselves that no matter where they live, they will not lose themselves. Unlike many peoples whose roots are severed after migration, the Tao have maintained a continuous spiritual flow. They do not cut off their past to assimilate into the present. Instead, they bind both together like a red thread stretching across time. That faith is passed from generation to generation through grandparents' stories, parents' eyes, each embroidery stitch, every drumbeat, every ritual chant. And then something remarkable happens. Children born in America, speaking English more than Tao, studying in American schools, immersed in American life, still feel an invisible pull back to their roots. When they attend a capsack ceremony, when they listen to ancestral chants, when they wear bright red Tao clothing, they feel what the Tao call the call of the forest. Not a real forest, but the forest in memory, the forest in their blood, the forest in every story passed down through thousands of years. The forest journeyed with their ancestors across China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and the forest came with them to America. Only now it no longer stood outside their windows, but lived in their hearts. It is that spiritual faith, steadfast, quiet, glowing like embers, that enabled the Tao people to survive every trial history placed before them. Not military power, not wealth, but the power of memory. To understand the endurance of the Tao, one must travel back through history to the moment when Vuong first placed stones on the earth, breathed life into the mountains and forests, and built the world with a father's loving hands for his children. The Tao believed that the universe was not born from random chaos, but from a purposeful hand, a passionate heart, a soul always oriented toward life. And from those ancient times, the Tao way of life took shape. Humans, ancestors, nature are not three separate entities, but three branches growing from the same great trunk. According to legend, when Vuong raised the first mountain range, people were not made to dominate nature, but to blend with it. The Tao look at a tall mountain not as an obstacle, but as a ladder reaching to the sky. They regard a stream not as a barrier, but as the Mother Earth's lifeblood. They see the forest trees not as lumber, but as siblings. Because of that, the Tao world is not simply about life and death, about gain or loss, benefit or harm. It is alive with spirit, a subtle connection among all that lives and has ever lived. That philosophy leads them to view their ancestors as part of present life. The Tao believe that their ancestors are always around them, in the wind's whisper, in the drifting clouds, in the early morning mist, in the night stream flowing softly. When they eat a meal, they invite their ancestors. When they carve a new path, they ask permission from the forest. When trouble comes, they pray for guidance from the mountain spirits. There is no absolute boundary between the physical world and the spiritual. The two weave together like clouds mingling with sky, like streams merging with rivers. Therefore, the Tao do not fear the world. They understand that every hardship is part of a journey. Deep forest is not an enemy, but a teacher of perseverance. Wild water is not danger. It is the ancestors' test. Plague, hunger, war, none drive them to despair because they believe the Tao spirit never dies. It may be challenged, may tremble, may grow weary, but it never extinguishes. It is this philosophy that has helped them never abandon each other. When living in the mountains, they relied on one another to survive wild beasts. When crossing forests into Laos or Thailand, they shared every handful of rice. In refugee camps, they cooked together in the same pot. When they arrived in America, they helped each other find jobs, learn English, learn a new life. The ancestors taught them that a person does not exist alone. They exist in community, in family lineage, and through the souls of those who came before. And the most astonishing thing is this: that philosophy did not vanish when they set foot on American soil, a place where fast-paced life, individualism, and social pressures could easily sweep away traditional values. On the contrary, it is precisely that challenging environment that made the Tao cling even tighter to their ancient philosophy. In America, they keep the ancestral rites, not because of superstition, but because those rites are the threads that keep them close. They preserve the red embroidery tradition, not to show off their culture, but because it is a way to remind their children of the bloodline of their ancestors. They observe the capsack initiation, to teach the young generation that growing up is not just about aging, but about knowing where they belong. They keep family meals and gatherings, so that even in a busy, fragmented society, they do not fall into the isolation that many Americans face. The philosophy, human, ancestors, nature, has now transformed into human, community, roots. The mountains and forests may have changed, but the spirit has not. And it is that steadfastness that makes the Tao exceptional among hundreds of other ethnic communities. The history of the Tao people is not a smooth, straight line. It is a rugged road, steep and winding, where each generation must face great upheavals, ones that might have erased an entire people. But the strange thing is, after every storm, the Tao did not crumble. They rose stronger, more united, and they preserved their identity even more tightly. To understand why a small ethnic group can overcome so many great challenges, we must look back at each crisis that forged them into steel. The first great crisis was the ancient plague. the one that forced them to leave their ancestral land, as we told in the earliest chapters. That was not only a flight from death, but the first lesson in solidarity. Whenever someone fell, the whole village lifted them. Whenever one family ran out of strength, the entire clan shared food. The Tao learned, if they did not stand together, they would not survive. The second crisis was the harshness of nature. The ancient forest was beautiful but brutal. There were seasons when wild beasts descended into the village, seasons when drought dried up the streams, seasons when bitter cold made people huddle in their small stilt houses. But instead of complaining, the Tao treated it as a training course sent by their ancestors. They learned to read animal tracks, to find new water sources, to use forest plants as medicine. And each time they overcame a challenge, they passed the lesson on to the next generation. Because of that, even when they came to America, living under completely different conditions, they still retained an astonishing spirit of adaptation. The third great upheaval was the conflicts among ethnic groups, especially during the period when the Tao expanded through Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. Living among countless peoples, the Tao chose the path of peace. They withdrew into the mountains, built villages in remote places to avoid war. They did not provoke, did not fight over land, did not seek power. It was precisely that humility which allowed them to survive when many other peoples were swept into cycles of conflict. A people who know how to avoid war is a people who know how to preserve their future. The fourth upheaval, and also the fiercest challenge, came during the modern migrations, when war and poverty pushed them to the edge. Many other ethnic groups dissolved completely under such pressure. But the Tao were different. They entered refugee camps together. They shared every meager bowl of rice. They preserved small ancestral ceremonies even in flimsy tents. They kept singing even when nights were filled with fear. They held on to the skill of embroidery so as not to lose memory. And most importantly, they held on to each other. No one was left behind. In those most brutal moments, their philosophy of people, ancestors, community shone brightest. When any place could collapse, their trust in one another became their last home. The fifth upheaval was the leap across the ocean, the journey to America full of uncertainty, where everything was foreign: language, food, weather, culture. Many immigrant communities dissolve into American society after just one generation. But the Tao did not. The first Tao who arrived in America immediately built communities, gathered together, lit incense, kept their rituals, rebuilt a village-like life in a new environment. They understood that if they did not preserve their roots, they would disappear. And then a strange thing happened. The more challenges they endured, the stronger their unity became. The more they migrated, the more they came to cherish their culture. The farther they lived from the mountains, the more they strove to keep the ancestral flame alive in their hearts. Many scholars call this the Tao cultural paradox. The more distant from the homeland, the stronger the culture grows. But to the Tao, this is not a paradox. This is the law of a people accustomed to living through hardship for thousands of years. In the migration stories of the Tao, there are chapters as bright and vivid as the red of their traditional clothes. But there are also chapters soaked with tears, wounds that have never fully healed, losses passed down across generations like ancestral sighs. To grasp the full journey of the Tao, we cannot skip those stories that the elders only tell in the dead of night, when the candle flame is low and the wind beyond the window is still, as though it too is listening. Many Tao families left the mountains not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to go in order to preserve their lives. Their crossings, fleeing from Vietnam to Laos, then from Laos to Thailand, from deep forests to refugee camps, were not always complete journeys. Some made it to a safe place. Some never arrived. And the most painful part is that many departed silently. No graves, no farewells, no place for their descendants to burn incense each new year. That sorrow became the hidden part of Tao history, rarely spoken of, but ever present, trailing every step that brought them to America. An elder once recounted that on the night they crossed into Laos, the river swelled to chest level. One wrong step and the whole group could be swept away. Among them was a 3-year-old child clinging tightly to her mother to avoid being carried off by the current. But the water was too strong. In a fleeting slip, The child fell from her mother's arms and vanished into the night. No one dared to scream, for fear of being discovered. All they could do was hold each other tightly and continue walking, silently crying as they went. The elder said, "That child still travels with us. She went with us to the refugee camp, to America. Her spirit remains part of us." Another family told of their crossing into Thailand. The father collapsed from starvation after 3 days without a grain of rice. The mother supported him, but could not save him. They had to press on. If they stopped, they risked being captured. The mother carried a small child, her tears flowing even as her footsteps remained relentless. That child later grew up in America, became an engineer, and when someone asked why he worked so hard, he only said, "I live for the part of my father who could no longer go on." In refugee camps, sickness ran rampant. Some children died of pneumonia after a single chill night. Some elders passed away in cramped tents, never seeing the future that lay ahead. The Tao had no land on which to bury their loved ones. With the simplest rituals, they bid farewell, lighting incense, watching their dead carried away. They did not know if the spirits could find their way back to their ancestors. But they believed that even without a grave, the ancestors would still recognize their children. There is a saying the Tao often repeat in those circumstances: to die is to return to the forest. Even if their loved ones died at the border, in a refugee camp, or on their way to America, they still believe that the soul returns to the ancestral forest, that place where the flame kindled by Vuong still burns through generations. When they came to America, those sorrows did not vanish. They accompanied them into every sleep, every incense offering, every story told to children. But the miracle was this: the pain did not make them collapse. On the contrary, it became a quiet source of strength, a reminder that they had sacrificed so much to arrive at today. The Tao in America work hard not only to feed their families, but to honor those who fell before them. They preserve rituals, traditional garments, language, not only for tradition's sake, but because they do not want any sacrifice to be in vain. Their descendants, those born in American hospitals, raised in American schools, speaking English as their first language, also feel that weight, even though they never lived through war or famine. When they hear grandparents recount the losses, they do not only feel sadness, they feel responsibility. Responsibility to live well. Responsibility to carry their culture forward. Responsibility to never forget the tear-filled journey that brought their family to America. And so from those pains that once seemed only to bring despair, the Tao created extraordinary strength. A strength that not only allowed them to survive through the darkest periods, but also to flourish in American society with heads held high. When those quiet sufferings were gently laid to rest, the next miracle on the Tao journey began: rebirth. This is not the rebirth of an individual, but the revival of an entire community that once lay amidst gunfire, hunger, and loss. On American soil, where everything was new and unfamiliar, the Tao began rebuilding life from zero. But it was precisely in that challenging environment that the inner strength passed down by their ancestors shone more brightly than ever. Many Tao families came to America with nothing. No English, no degrees, no clear trade. All they carried was the memory of the forest, the diligence of their forebears, and the belief that no matter how dark the road ahead, every step forward brings them closer to the future. For that reason, they started with the jobs that many native-born Americans did not want: picking fruit, farm work, meat processing, cleaning, nail salons, factory assembly lines. Some tell of the first day of work, standing in a vast cold warehouse, hands trembling from the chill. He did not understand the manager's instructions. He only nodded and followed instinct. That night, his hands cracked, his eyes stung with exhaustion. But he did not complain. He remembered what his father had told him while crossing deep forests. "Just keep walking, child. The sun will rise." And indeed, the sun rose, not over the mountains and forests, but over American soil. Some Tao families, after only a few years of work, managed to save enough to buy their first home. On the day they moved in, they cried, never imagining that after living in refugee tents, they could touch the American dream. In their living room, they hung a portrait of Vuong as a reminder that no matter where the home is, their roots remain the same. Many Dao people worked in nail salons from morning until night, their hands calloused and exposed to harsh chemicals, yet in their hearts burned bright hope. They knew that every dollar earned was a step forward for their children's future, and the second and third generations proved it. There are Dao children who became doctors, engineers, nurses, researchers, members of the military, even successful entrepreneurs. Some would say, I follow in my parents' footsteps. From their rough hands, I have steady hands to build the future. There is a touching story. A Dao boy who once lived in a refugee camp in Thailand, playing on dusty ground with nothing to play with but a few sticks. After moving to America, he studied English by watching cartoons and quietly listening to classmates speak in the schoolyard. No one in class thought he would succeed. He was too quiet and poor at English. But he was diligent, persistent, always remembering his mother's final words before she died. Study so you will not suffer anymore in the future. 20 years later, that boy became a PhD, conducting research on the cultures of Southeast Asian minority peoples. When he stood on stage to receive his degree, he said, I stand here because my mother can no longer stand. These stories are not rare. They are pieces of a larger picture, the Dao people's powerful revival in America, not as isolated cases, but as a community rising from ashes. What they lost in deep forests, they compensated for with resilience. What they left behind at the borders, they replaced with determination. What they endured with pain, they turned into motivation. And then they turned around to help other Dao newcomers. To a Dao family newly arrived in America, there is always a helping hand from those who came before. A job guide, an encouraging word in old Dao language, a home-cooked dish from the homeland, a place to sleep, a small flame in the freezing American snow. Bit by bit, families were reborn. Spiritual villages were rebuilt. Generations stretched tall toward life like mighty trees rising from seeds battered by storms. As they entered a strong period of revival, the Dao in America no longer lived merely to survive the present. They began to reach upward to shape a future. This is the era in which the Dao community transformed from silent immigrants into storytellers of their own history. This is the time when they no longer stood on the margins of American history, but stepped into it, full of confidence, dignity, and pride. At first, the presence of the Dao in American society meant only simple jobs, working farms, nail salons, factories. But when the second and third generations came of age, the doors began to open. Young Dao people, raised on their parents' grit and their ancestors' resilience, started stepping into fields they once never dared to dream of. Some became teachers in large public schools, weaving their people's story into lessons on culture and history. When a student asks, "You're Hmong?" they smile and say, "No, I'm Dao. Let me tell you who we are." And for the first time, Dao culture is spoken in American classrooms by Dao voices, not through vague textbooks or mistaken identity. Others became police officers, soldiers, standing in ranks that protect the country that embraced their family. On their shoulders rests the American flag, but in their hearts, the beat of the cap-sack drum. And when they tell their comrades how their ancestors once crossed mountains, forded rivers, survived wars, Americans fall silent and listen, as though hearing a living legend. Some Dao became doctors, opening clinics in California and Minnesota. Each time they welcome a Dao patient, they treat them in both English and Dao. Where does it hurt? Is your heart racing? Do not worry, I'm also Dao, I understand. In that moment, patients feel warmth not only from medicine, but from heritage itself. Alongside these professional strides, the Dao began building strong community institutions. Cultural gatherings, festivals, seminars, traditional art classes are now organized more publicly and professionally than ever. They no longer keep their culture locked inside family walls. They bring it into the light so America can see them, respect them. In California, Dao cultural festivals have become annual events drawing thousands. Americans come to witness the bright red garments, the drum and gong rituals, the ancestral calling songs, the shows of traditional embroidery. Dao children stand on stage, hands trembling but eyes bright, reciting the legend of Vuong in fluent English. The auditorium falls silent, touched by emotion. In Minnesota, a group of young Dao launched a project called Dao Voices, collecting the stories of elders, recording them in both Dao and English, then archiving them in a digital library. Each tale is told in a shaky but honest voice. Stories of forest crossings, border escapes, loss, love, faith in ancestors in darkest nights. These recordings do more than help Dao people understand their own history. They show younger generations that they were born of strong souls. Not only did the Dao preserve their traditions, but they also reinvented them. A group of young artists began to create modern music combining Dao drums, bells, and flutes with American electronic beats. When the songs went viral online, people commented, "This music sounds ancient and futuristic at the same time." That is the Dao spirit, one foot rooted in the ancient mountains and forests, the other stepping into the world of the future. In business, Dao families began launching larger enterprises. From small nail salons, they grew into chains of shops. From farm labor, they founded agricultural distribution companies. Some became owners of popular restaurants, bringing Dao cuisine to American tables. They turned smoked meat, forest vegetables, herbal soups, traditional cakes, and more into dishes praised by the American media. But thriving success did not mean losing their identity. On the contrary, the more successful they became, the more they wanted younger generations to understand. We have arrived here because those before us fell. And so whenever the community held a major ceremony, successful young people still bowed before the ancestral altar, reminding themselves that they are just one link in the long chain of their people. A current that began with Vuong and continues now on American soil. The rapid growth of the Dao in America cannot be separated from a very important process: generational transmission. This is the time when the elders, living witnesses to the entire journey across mountains, forests, borders, seas, began passing their memories to children born in America. And it was not just culture they handed down, but the soul of an entire people. In every Dao family, there is always an elder who plays the role of storyteller. They may not know much English, but they know every mountain in their homeland. They may not read American documents, but remember every ritual chant, every ancient song, every custom passed down from their parents. They do not need gilded words. Just sit down, light an incense stick, look into the eyes of their grandchildren and say, "Let me tell you." And in that moment, the past comes alive. Children of Dao descent born in America listen at first with curiosity, then with emotion, and finally, their outlook on the world changes completely. They understand they are not only American students, not only American youth. They are the descendants of people who crossed forests while keeping the ancestral fire alive. Some families hold story nights every weekend. In a small living room, parents and grandparents sit on one side, while the children sit opposite, hugging pillows, quietly listening. The stories told are not only about hunger or cold, but about solidarity, belief, resilience. Some children cry when they hear about a grandfather who was lost in the forest for 2 days while escaping war. Some children smile with fascination when they hear about bright festivals in their ancestral villages. Those evenings weave a thread that links two worlds that seem unrelated: the mountains and forests of Southeast Asia and their home in a modern American city. One beautiful thing is that the younger generation has started to ask more questions. "Grandma, what was life like back then? Dad, how did we come to America? Grandpa, am I really Dao?" The question, "Am I really Dao?" makes many elders choke up, because that moment when the new generation affirms their identity isn't forced. It comes from the heart. Alongside oral stories, the Dao elders also pass down skills and rituals. They teach children embroidery, patterns where every stitch carries meaning. They teach traditional cooking, how to prepare ancestral offerings, how to call on their ancestors. Dao children born in America may be clumsy the first time they handle a needle, but when the first stitch completes a bright red pattern, they sense something sacred. This is mine. At big ceremonies, Dao elders guide young people how to tie the headscarf properly, how to hold the drum in the right rhythm, how to stand before the ancestral altar with respect. When a young Dao man receives the initiation, in America, where there are no deep forests or silver streams like in the old land, the elders say to him, "It does not matter where your feet stand. What matters is that you remember who you are." And strangely, many young Dao born in America, who once felt lost between two cultures, have found their true identity through those rituals. They stand in an American hall, yet feel like they are back in their ancestral village, surrounded by drums, bells, and calls from the past. Meanwhile, the young Tao who understand technology are doing something else. They record every ritual with cameras. They digitize the ancestral texts. They build a database for each family's history. They turn the elders' memories into data for the future. Thanks to that, Tao culture no longer depends on the memory of a few individuals. It is preserved through modern technology and can be passed down for hundreds of years to come. The most important thing in this process of passing the legacy is not just passing on information. It is passing on the spirit, passing on the path, passing on the belief that Tao people will always stand firm, no matter where they are. And here is why the Tao community in America is so resilient. They do not let generational gaps separate them. They do not let a new era erase old roots. They build a bridge, and on that bridge walks the future of their people. The generational transmission has opened the way for a turning point, the awakening of the young Tao generation in America. This is the moment when the children born in America, raised on fast food, American schools, social media, English as their breath, suddenly look back and ask themselves, where do I come from? Who am I? These young people grow up between two worlds. By day, they blend in as American students. Jeans, sneakers, multiracial friends, dreams of college, office jobs, modern life. But when they come home, they see their grandmother wearing red embroidered Tao clothes, their parents lighting incense for their ancestors. They see thick ancestral prayer books with mysterious letters they never learned at school. Inside them, there is always a quiet space, a question without an answer. Am I losing something important? And then the moment of awakening often comes unexpectedly, during an initiation ceremony, at a cultural festival, listening to the Mo shaman's chants, in the golden candlelight falling on a traditional red costume. In that moment, they realize that identity is not something that comes naturally. It is something to be rediscovered, preserved, and lived. The young Tao generation begins to see their culture not as a burden, but as a treasure. They see the sacrifices of their parents, the rough hands from factory work. They see the strength of their elders, people who survived forest crossings and forced migrations without complaints. They understand that they stand on the shoulders of a whole people who endured so much so that they could have today. That realization awakens them. A young Tao in Minnesota once said, "I tried to live like an American, but then I realized Tao culture doesn't limit me. It makes me stronger." And so the young generation began to act, not because they were forced, but because their hearts urged them. They learned Tao language, they learned embroidery, they learned songs, they learned ancestral rites, they learned the stories of Vuong. They went looking for their identity as though retrieving a forgotten part of themselves. Many young Tao formed cultural groups, clubs, organized workshops to teach each other how to embroider, cook traditional foods, read ancient Tao script. They no longer hesitated to wear Tao garments in American halls. They even proudly posted on social media, "This is my culture. This is who I am." Some young Tao traveled back to the forests of Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand in search of their roots. They met local Tao people, talked, recorded, filmed, connecting the two halves of their world into one. When they returned to America, they brought back not only memories, but a flame in their eyes. A fire that said, "Now I know where I belong." A beautiful phenomenon emerged. The children born Tao in America began to feel proud of their surnames. They did not change their names to sound more American. They kept surnames like Ban, Trio, Vuong, Li, Tan, the traditional names that have sustained their people for millennia. And then young Tao people started doing what earlier generations could not, telling the Tao story to the whole world. They opened YouTube channels, TikTok accounts, podcasts. They told about the Cap Sack initiation ceremony, about the legend of Ban Vuong, about the journey across borders, about Tao people rebuilding their lives in America. They rewrote history in a new language, the language of their generation, the language of the internet. One video about Tao clothing reached 3 million views. One Tao EDM music track spread across the globe. A TEDx talk by a young Tao woman was praised by American media as a story of resilience, the story of a small ethnic group that never disappears. From silence in the ancient forests, the Tao have now raised their voice in modern society, confident, clear, strong. no longer asking, "Who are we?" but declaring, "We are Tao people, and we are still here." The awakening of the young generation did not just help them find themselves, it opened a new chapter for the community, a chapter in which the Tao begin to bring their culture to the world not as a tragic story, but as an inspiring one. When young Tao in America awakened and started telling their own story, a new phenomenon began, something unprecedented in thousands of years of their history. Tao culture was no longer preserved only in the community, but began to spread globally. Americans, Europeans, Asians started to be curious, then fascinated, then deeply drawn to the culture of a small but astonishingly rich people. At first, this spread came from short videos on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. A Tao girl posted a clip showing how to wear the bright red traditional garment, embroidered with delicate patterns so intricate that viewers in the US zoomed in to admire every detail. That clip got over 1 million views. Comments like, "Where is this culture from? It's beautiful," flooded in, and she replied, "We are Tao people." For the first time, the two words Tao people resonated across global social media like a distant drumbeat. Then, a Tao young man mixed traditional Tao music with modern American electronic beats. The drum and bell sounds used in ritual ceremonies fused with EDM bass, the ancient ritual to modern rhythms. Americans called it ancient futuristic, timeless yet futuristic. That song spread across Spotify, was remixed by white DJs, and brought Tao sound into major music festivals. No one expected that the sound from a remote Asian highland village could touch the hearts of tens of thousands of Americans dancing under neon lights. But that was only the beginning. Tao culture has started to enter academia in the US. Universities invite Tao people to speak. Student papers and theses about the Tao diaspora, the overseas Tao community, are becoming more numerous. Some American scholars even travel to Vietnam or Laos to study Tao people deeply, bringing back stories, manuscripts, embroidery samples, songs to include in curricula. The history of the Tao, once marginalized, is now taken seriously in academic research. Ethos, spirit of the community, plus 2 iGuide, plus 2 museums in the US begin to exhibit Tao clothing, Tao rituals, Tao musical instruments. Visitors stare in awe at the fine hand embroidery, at the mysterious ancient Tao script, at rituals that trace back to ancestral legends. Garments once worn only in remote highland villages are displayed under art lights, leaving the world to marvel. How did such a small group create such a rich culture? And the most remarkable thing is this. The Tao never try to market their culture. They never force it, never package it, never turn it into a performance. They do not try to make America like them. They do not build campaigns or branding strategies. They simply live with honesty, tell their story truthfully, and share it with sincerity. And it is precisely that quiet authenticity that moves Americans. An American teacher, after witnessing a capsack ceremony for the first time, whispered, "This is the most spiritual ceremony I have ever seen. It feels pure, like a connection to something ancient and real." An American journalist writing about the Tao community in California concluded, "They lost their land, but they never lost their soul." Some Americans who learned about Tao culture began joining the community. They learned basic embroidery stitches. They learned the ritual songs. Some even helped organize Tao festivals with genuine respect, not as observers, but as participants. Tao festivals in America are no longer gatherings of Tao people alone. Americans come, Japanese, Hmong, Laotians, Hispanics, all come, dance, sing, laugh together. Many Americans don traditional Tao garments, not as cosplay, not for aesthetics, but for honor, for respect, for reverence toward a culture they find pure, beautiful, and profound. And then came the moment that marked a turning point. The Tao stepped onto the world stage. A group of Tao artists were invited to Europe to perform the capsack drum ritual. When the first drum beat echoed through the hall, the European audience stood still, as if time itself had paused. Another group was invited to New York for a cultural fashion week. They walked not like runway models, but like carriers of a 1,000-year soul. American media wrote, "The Tao people walk like they carry their mountains with them." From that moment, the story of the Tao crossed oceans, crossed languages, crossed the walls of the world's largest museums and institutions. Tao culture, once hidden in remote highland villages, is now recognized as a heritage worth preserving for all humanity. But this global recognition did not begin with grand speeches or strategic plans. It began with something much simpler, something the Tao have carried for thousands of years. They never forget who they are. They never forget the ancient mountains and forests. They never forget the chants, the red garments, the drum beats. They never forget Vuong, the father who shaped the world with his hands. Because they carry their identity with quiet pride, because they guard their roots like sacred fire, because they enter the world without losing themselves. When the Tao step into the global spotlight, they do not dissolve. They shine, unmistakably Tao. As Tao culture quietly spread through American society, something unexpected, almost miraculous, happened. The Tao were no longer the only ones sharing their culture with the world. The world began seeking them. In a society overwhelmed by stress, loneliness, hyper-individualism, and spiritual exhaustion, many Americans began craving something older, deeper, more rooted. And they found it in Tao culture, a culture that does not chase spectacle, but carries a raw, grounding spiritual power. Many Americans said they first came to a Tao festival out of curiosity, but they stayed because of the peace they felt. When the drums of the capsack ceremony echo, Americans, people raised on rock, EDM, hip-hop, suddenly fall completely silent. The sound does not feel like music. It feels like breathing, like the heartbeat of an ancient people. Some said the drum speaks to something deep I didn't know I had. When they watch Tao families offering incense to ancestors, they do not see superstition. They see devotion, gratitude, a bond across generations that modern society has forgotten. When they see an elder guiding a child to embroider red patterns, they do not see a craft, they see legacy. They see identity being passed from hand to hand. One American teacher, after attending a Tao ceremony, told the community, "In your culture, I see something we have lost: family, respect, and a sense of belonging." And then a quiet shift occurred. Americans began learning from the Tao. They learned to slow down. They learned to value roots more than speed. They learned to honor ancestors, even if they had never done so before. They learned to see nature not as a resource to exploit, but as a companion that walks with them. They learned that success means nothing if family is lost. They learned that gratitude is a stronger source of peace than money. Some Tao cultural centers began offering meditation inspired by Tao tradition. Not the silent, empty meditation of modern apps, but a meditation tied to earth, sky, wind, water, rooted in the Tao worldview. Americans who joined said it was the first time they felt ancient peace settle into their hearts. Others came to learn embroidery. They wanted to understand every stitch, every red thread, every hidden meaning. And when they held the needle, they discovered that embroidery was not just art. It was meditation. It was healing. It was a return to themselves. Many Americans said that the act of slow, careful stitching helped them mend the spiritual wounds created by modern life. Tao culture, once carried only by people from deep Asian forests, became a gift to a world desperate for grounding, meaning, belonging, and soul. And the Tao shared it not by preaching, not by marketing, not by trying to impress. They shared it by simply being who they are. A university in California even introduced an unprecedented course titled Tao Philosophy and Modern Life. In that classroom, American students sit before elders wearing bright red garments, listen to the Mo's ancient chants, study the human ancestors' nature belief, and analyze how a small community preserved its soul through war, migration, and exile. The course became so popular that students now have to register months in advance just to get a seat. Professors described it as the most eye-opening cultural class we've ever offered. And something even more extraordinary happened. American mental health experts began studying Tao community psychology. They were stunned. Despite having endured war, famine, exile, loss, and the trauma of displacement, the Tao in America show lower depression rates than national averages. Why? Because of something America desperately lacks: family bonds, a tight community, a collective healing, faith that their ancestors walk with them, a worldview that refuses to let anyone suffer alone. A U.S. psychotherapist summarized it in a research report, a line now quoted in many conferences. Open quote, "The Tao community heals each other before the world even knows they're hurting." Close quote. From a people once invisible in the shadows of the mountains, the Tao have quietly become spiritual guides for Americans searching for purpose and grounding. Not because the Tao preach, not because they seek followers, but because their way of life is itself a lesson. And then a new phenomenon emerged, something beautiful and unexpected. Americans began joining Tao events not as spectators, but as participants. They wore Tao garments with respect. They danced in Tao circles. They learned the drum rhythms with reverence. They ate traditional meals like honored guests. And the Tao opened their arms wide. Because the Tao do not draw hard boundaries. They never have. Anyone who respects the culture is a friend. Anyone who honors the ancestors is family. This openness sparked something powerful inside the young Tao generation. For the first time, they saw Americans admire the culture their grandparents had fought so hard to protect. They saw Tao embroidery displayed in museums, Tao philosophy taught in universities, Tao rituals filmed by American scholars, Tao stories published in research journals. It awakened something deep. Our culture is not just something we keep, it is something the world values. And from that realization, a turning point began. The burden of preservation shifted. It could no longer rest solely on the shoulders of grandparents, the last generation who lived through forests, borders, and refugee camps. The younger Tao, born in American hospitals, raised in American schools, fluent in English, suddenly understood. If we want the Tao to go far on American soil, then we must carry the torch. Not later, not someday, now. Because culture only travels forward if those who inherit it choose to lift it high. And in that moment, a new generation of Tao rose. Not as silent children in the back of community halls, but as leaders who know exactly who they are and are ready to guide the next chapter of their people's journey. And so, for the first time in history, the Tao witnessed a marvel. The young generation did not wait to be assigned a task. They stepped up and took it, on their own. Not because they were pressured, not because they feared losing their roots, but because they truly understood the value of what they already had. As Tao culture became a source of pride on social media, in schools, on American stages, young Tao began to realize that their ethnic identity was not a weight dragging them backward. It was something that lifted them higher. They began organizing Tao youth leadership events, not to teach politics or business, but to teach things that American textbooks never can. Respect for ancestors, the meaning of initiation rites, the importance of community, how to stay humble and united, how to become a bridge between tradition and modernity. These classes are not led by elders, but by the young, teaching each other, from language to customs, from ancient music to modern music, inspired by Tao heritage. In a gathering, you might see a striking scene. An American-born Tao girl stands on a stage, holding the traditional headscarf, explaining in fluent English the meaning of every embroidered motif. A Tao young man with bleached hair, headphones on, yet wearing a vivid red Tao outfit, declaring, "I thought I had to choose between being Tao and being American. Turns out, I can be both." Another group of youth leading incense lighting rituals, but instead of rigidly following old ways, they explain its spiritual meaning in a way Gen Z can understand. That is the clearest expression of identity awakening. The young generation does not just preserve culture the old way. They reinterpret, reimagine, recreate it in a way that allows it to thrive in a new era. They organize new, modern Tao festivals, still with drums, bells, and sacred rituals, but now also projected on LED screens, paired with live music, and interpreted in English so international friends can understand. They launch podcasts sharing what it is like to grow up as Tao in America. They hold workshops teaching embroidery, teaching songs, teaching the Tao script. They establish a Tao Youth Scholarship fund for Tao students enrolled in college. They organize the first ever Tao Leadership Summit in the United States, a leadership conference for Tao. At the same time, they do what previous generations never dared to dream of. They rewrite Tao history from their own perspective. Many young Tao begin interviewing their grandparents to capture every fragment of memory. They make documentary films using smartphones and modern cameras. They record initiation rituals with professional microphones to preserve them for 100 years to come. They build a website called Tao Cultural Archive to document everything: traditional clothing, rituals and ceremonies, language, family lineages, migration routes, myths and legends, stories of survival. Every small action by this young generation is like laying a brick in building their people's future. They are not just preserving their culture. They are protecting it, developing it, carrying it forward, and, most importantly, making it live in the modern age. From children once embarrassed to be different in American schools, today they stand before crowds with full confidence. I am Tao, and I am proud of that. Not only that, they inspire their parents too. Parents who once worried that their culture would fade away as their children adapted to American society. Now they see their children singing in Tao, embroidering Tao garments, telling Tao stories, studying Tao culture. They realize that the Tao people are not just surviving, they are thriving. When Tao culture in America reaches its most confident and brilliant stage, a new trend naturally emerges. Tao youth at home in America begin a journey of return. Not a return in the sense of migration, but a return to find their roots, to find their ancestors. To find the part of their soul that they have always felt whispering in their hearts, like a call from the distant mountains, a place they have never stood on but have belonged to since birth. They grew up with English, with American friends, with American culture. But every time they put on Tao clothes, heard the drum beats, or saw their parents lighting incense, they felt it deeply. A part of me is not in America. It lies in the homeland of my ancestors. And so began journeys across the ocean. Not tearful migrations like the old generations, but intentional travels, full of longing, full of hope to touch their roots. Young Tao Americans stepping foot in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, lands where their ancestors lived for generations, felt like they entered the dreams their grandparents had told throughout their childhood. Mist-covered high mountains, streams softly running through villages, emerald terraced rice fields, simple wooden houses. And above all, ancestral Tao people with kind eyes and familiar smiles, as if they had known each other in a past life. One young Tao American cried when he saw an old Tao elder dressed in traditional red embroidery sitting on the wooden porch. The elder looked at them, a young person with dyed hair, sneakers, speaking English, but she recognized immediately. "You are Tao." That simple phrase awakened everything they had been searching for. They visited old Tao villages, met distant relatives surnames like Ban, Trio, Lai, Tan. They stood before ancestral altars, bowed 3 times as they had been taught in America. They listened to a Mo shaman reciting ancient prayers in the old language, the same language they were learning again. They lit candles with local Tao people, ate rice cooked in bamboo, drank forest wine, listened to traditional flute songs, watched ancient dances. And in that moment, they understood something profound. Their ancestors did not belong merely to a territory. Their ancestors belonged to their bloodline. And the bloodline, no matter where it flows, always returns to its root. Several young Americans of Tao descent began digging into their family genealogies, searching for ancestral roots lost during migration. When they connected with a branch of their extended family they had never met, both sides cried like they had found lost relatives, because they realized that the ocean might separate people physically, but a bloodline never breaks. It turned out that a journey looking for roots was not only about emotions. Many young Tao Americans went even further. They collected documents, filmed to record ancient ceremonies. They learned traditional embroidery directly from the elders. They recorded the old Tao language to preserve it. They bought Tao musical instruments to bring back to the US. They participated in initiation ceremonies in their ancestral villages. They made documentary films about their journey to find their roots. One group of Tao American youths even rode bicycles across the mountains in Haijiang just to walk the paths their ancestors once walked. Standing on a mountaintop, looking down on the old village, they held each other and cried. Because for the first time in their lives, they felt complete. A completeness that no matter how vast or glamorous America might be, it could not give them. A Tao girl born in California said, "I did not find my roots found me." Thanks to these journeys back home, a spiritual bridge was built. One end is the mountains and forests of Southeast Asia, the mother of Tao culture. The other end is America, where Tao people are writing a new chapter in their history. Although the two shores across the ocean seem far apart, because of the young generation, they have become a continuous path. The path their ancestors began under Vuong, now continued by their descendants with fresh hearts and new minds. Those return home journeys did not only transform individual young Dao raised in the US, they changed an entire community. When these youths bring a renewed flame back to America, they do not return empty-handed. They return carrying reborn memory, a history felt with hands, and a fierce pride in a people they once only knew through stories. And that flame spreads quickly, like sparks lit in a calm night of the ancient forest. When they come back to America, they bring back things that images alone could never capture. The smell of hearth smoke in the ancestral village, the sound of wind rustling through bamboo trees, the feeling of setting foot on the soft soil of their forefathers' land, the laughter of Dao kin when they finally see relatives return from afar. They bring back not just culture, but the primal spirit of their ancestors, the force that made the Dao people strong across thousands of years. From the moment they landed at the American airport, many young Dao felt their lives had turned a new page. They no longer saw Dao culture as something old, for the elders, or unrelated to America. They saw it as a part of their identity, one they had a responsibility to carry forward, because they had seen with their own eyes how beautiful and deep it truly is. And thus, a new wave began to spread through the Dao community in the United States. 1. Young people formed professional preservation groups. Instead of simply holding traditional community gatherings, they launched groups such as Dao Cultural Research Group, Dao Heritage Preservation Team, Dao Youth Historian Project, Dao Traditional Music Revival, Dao Embroidery Masterclass. They no longer preserved culture by guesswork, but by serious study. They interviewed hundreds of Dao elders in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand. They compiled books, built websites, made in-depth documentary films. They created digital archives to preserve all rituals, songs, ancestral texts, and traditional clothing. 2. They brought Dao culture into American schools. Many young Dao became speakers, standing before American students to tell about the legend of Vuong and creation, the journey through mountains and rivers, the migration through borders and across the ocean, traditional embroidery art, the Capsack initiation ceremony, the Dao philosophy, human, ancestors, nature. These presentations moved many American students to tears. Several schools even added Dao culture into their ethnic studies curriculums. 3. They organized the first Dao Cultural Week in the U.S., a week-long festival including drum performances from Capsack ceremonies, traditional Dao costume shows, screenings of documentaries about migration journeys, embroidery workshops and traditional cooking classes, folk song contests and storytelling sessions, exhibitions tracing Dao global family lineages on world maps. Americans came not just out of curiosity anymore, but out of admiration. 4. They connected Dao people globally into a unified network. For the first time in history, Dao from the US, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, China, France, Australia, Canada gathered in online global meetings. They discussed language preservation, revival of lost rituals, standardization of traditional motifs, supporting newly arrived Dao immigrants to America, cross-continental cultural exchange. What once seemed impossible became real. The global Dao community united as one family. 5. Young Dao began creating new culture. They fused Dao music with jazz, hip-hop, pop. They drew modern-style illustrations of Ban Vuong. They wrote children's books based on Dao legends. They designed modern traditional Dao clothing, blending old and new. They made films recounting their parents' migration journeys. Their culture was no longer merely preserved. It was reborn, alive, sharper than ever. 6. They inspired the older generation. Many Dao parents once feared their children would lose their roots. But when they saw their children returning from trips to Vietnam with bright eyes, when they saw them embroider Dao garments with American hands but Dao hearts, when they heard them chanting ancestral prayers in hesitant but respectful tones, they realized something profound. The Dao people were not just surviving, they were thriving. They understood that Dao culture has not been lost. It is simply transforming into a new form. Many elders said they were at peace because finally the young generation has reclaimed their soul. And the result is a cultural explosion within the Dao community in America, a phase in which the Dao are no longer just preserving their culture for themselves, but turning it into a source of inspiration for the world. Now, As the story reaches its final page, we look back at the Tao journey as if reading an epic spanning thousands of years, a grand saga that is both fierce and gentle, tragic yet full of hope. The story begins in primordial time, when Vuong shaped the earth, placing the first stone for a small people whose spirit was as strong as the mountains. And through centuries, the Tao left deep forests, crossed wars, famine, exile, migration, sea, and border, ultimately setting foot upon far-off lands like Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and even the United States, places they thought they came to just to survive, but which instead became where they reborn themselves. Looking back, one thing stands undeniable. The Tao have never been victims of history. They are the makers of history. They did not let circumstances decide their fate. They traveled far, but never lost their roots. They changed, but never dissolved. They were poor, but never bowed to fate. And the most miraculous thing is that no matter where they go, the Tao carry with them three things that no one can take away: the ancestral flame, the call of the mountains and forests, the pride of a people who know who they are. Today, on American soil, a place entirely different from their ancestral villages among streams and mountains, the Tao not only survive but flourish brilliantly. They build community, raise talented young generations who integrate but do not lose identity. They turn Tao culture into a source of inspiration for Americans, transforming ancient rituals into spiritual heritage respected worldwide. If Vuong could see his descendants today, surely he would smile. Because the Tao have not only preserved the flame he passed to them, they have made that flame burn brighter than ever before. Young Tao in America, born in modern cities, raised with English but carrying Tao hearts, have become the next generation in this endless journey. They know they carry a responsibility to preserve the past, live fully in the present, and write the future. They will continue telling their ancestors' story to the world, in videos, on stages, in classrooms, in films, and in every small conversation. They will continue connecting with their homeland, not only through trips, but through daily actions. They will continue opening their arms wide so that Tao culture is not just for Tao people, but a spiritual gift for anyone who longs for authenticity, peace, and connection with nature. And someday, when a Tao child in the future stands in America, looks into the mirror and asks, "Who am I?" there will be a confident answer, no hesitation. I am Tao. I belong to a people whose history is as long as mountains, deep as forests, and strong as stone. I carry within me the strength of thousands of generations of ancestors. No matter how the world changes, no matter how many countries Tao descendants live in, no matter whether ancient forests remain or vanish, one thing will always remain true: Tao blood never fades. And the journey of the Tao, from Vuong to America, will continue to be written through each new generation. The video ends, but the story is not over, because the Tao are still alive, still walking, still opening new chapters that their ancestors once dreamed of. And to everyone listening to this story, whether Tao or not, you carry within you a flame, the flame of resilience, identity, and faith in your roots. The story ends here, but the legacy lives on, and the Tao will travel far. If you have accompanied me to this very moment, it means the story of the Tao, of Vuong, of migrations, of spiritual strength across forests and oceans, has touched you in some way. But remember, what you have just heard is only the first chapter in a vast cultural treasure of the Tao. There are countless mysteries left: rituals, legends, survival stories, remarkable migrations waiting to be told. In the next videos, you will get to discover the secrets of the Kapsak initiation ceremony, one of the most ancient coming-of-age rites in Southeast Asia, the legends of the 12 heroic ancestors, of sacred forests and mountain spirits, the journeys across mountains and forests of the Tao into Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, the lives of modern Tao, how they preserve their identity in a globalized world, and especially the untold stories. Real people, real memories, Tao bloodlines that cross the ocean to America. If you want to understand deeper a people who have endured 1,000 years of storms, yet held on to a burning soul, hit subscribe so you don't miss any part of this grand series. Stay with us. The journey to discover the Tao has only just begun. See you in the next video, where another Tao story will unfold, even more vivid, emotional, and profound.